All right, welcome everyone to the 12th session of the Schoolyard Forest Design Lecture Series. My name is Lauren McKenna with Green Schoolyards America, and supporting me today are my colleagues Allison Torres and lots of other Green Schoolyards staff. Today's agenda will include a brief intro from Green Schoolyards, plus a presentation from our guest speakers, followed by some Q&A time. This series, as a reminder, is part of the National Schoolyard Forest System, whose goal is to increase tree canopy and shade students from extreme heat. This is a large-scale initiative in partnership with CAL FIRE, the California Department of Education, and 10 Strands. We've begun this work in California, but we do have plans to expand to other states. So thank you for your support in this work so far. There are a couple resources in our online library that do relate to today's topic of school tree stewardship, in large part put together by my colleague Rachel. Part one of How to Care for Schoolyard Forests, she shared at a previous webinar and highlights stewardship principles that underscore a needed shift in our relationship to the land and our nation's schools. It also outlines best practices for ongoing care of schoolyard forests and living schoolyards. Part two, which she'll share some in more detail today, shares more specific tasks and tips. Both are full of great tips, examples, additional resources. You can find part one and two in the link in the chat. And we'll also share a selection of some external resources that are featured within those resources. But again, Rachel will share more on these later. There are also resources on our website for educators wanting to not only teach students about trees, but also engage them in planning, planting, and caring for schoolyard forests. We encourage all to promote an ethos of care and stewardship for the earth, and of course, what better place than the schoolyard to foster that. You can also see lecture number 7 from this series on stewardship part 1 and stewardship tasks with students. Again, my colleague Rachel is featured in that along with my colleague Aisha. A reminder that today's free lecture will be publicly available on our website sometime next week. Note that we will be taking a break over the holidays and into the new year, but we hope to see you again in February of next year. And we hope we can continue this series beyond that, but we'll keep you all updated. In the meantime, please also check out the relaunched Community of Practice for Schoolyard Forests hosted by our colleague Michaela Randolph. These sessions are also free, will feature school districts and organizations, plus include the opportunity to connect with fellow schoolyard greening advocates like yourselves. Typically, these sessions will be the third Thursday of each month. The last session that we held featured really amazing schoolyards in Berlin, Germany, and lots of inspiration for our schoolyard forest efforts here in the US. The next session will be January 16th of next year and will feature schoolyard forest efforts in San Antonio, Texas. So please check out the link in the chat and register and invite your friends. Okay, so today's topic will cover an introduction to stewarding school trees for long-term benefit. Our speakers today will dive into the latest urban forestry research on tree care and its significance to tree survival, growth, and health, as well as ensuring community involvement and long-term benefits. They'll also share important stewardship tasks over a tree's life cycle, from newly planted young to older mature trees. So to introduce our wonderful speakers, Lara Roman is a research ecologist with the USDA Forest Service. Her research centers on the temporal dynamics of urban forests, including tree mortality and growth, canopy cover change, historical legacies, species composition change, and the factors constraining or enabling tree planting in diverse neighborhoods. These studies involve collaborations with municipal agencies and nonprofit organizations, and her contributions to urban forestry practice were recognized with an early career scientist award from the International Society of Arboriculture. She received a PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, and a bachelor's in biology and master's of environmental studies from the University of Pennsylvania. And my colleague, Rachel Pringle, is Green Schoolyards America's vice president and oversees organizational operations and management, along with other senior leadership, including overseeing the schoolyard forest system expansion in the states of Nevada and New Mexico. Previously, she was the VP of Growth and Strategic Partnerships at Education Outside, which brought science and environmental literacy to over 60 green schoolyards in the Bay Area. She helped develop Education Outside's AmeriCorps program. Her career in education began in a public school garden classroom and then environmental education programming with Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy. She has a degree in anthropology, a master's in conservation biology from the University of Pennsylvania, and is also co-author of How to Grow a School Garden, a complete guide for parents and teachers from Timber Press. So wonderful introduction, I think, for two people who have been active in school greening for many years and active in understanding urban forestry. And so today we're going to be blending those two things together. So thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Lara, for being here. And reminder for attendees, if you have any questions for our speakers, please add them to the chat and we will try to address them either in the chat or during Q&A at the end of their presentation. I will pass it off to Lara.
Wonderful, thank you. Let me share my screen. You all see that? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Well, hello everyone, and thank you to GSA for having me here today. I am excited to be speaking as part of this webinar series, and I'm going to be speaking today about maintenance and stewardship and the crucial role that these play in keeping trees alive and healthy. And I'll be speaking from the perspective of urban forestry, which is the science and management of trees in cities, towns, and suburbs. Many school planting projects happen through urban tree planting initiatives. And so even though I'll be speaking a lot about studies of street and park trees, there's a lot of common issues with school grounds. And with that, I will dive right in. So what is the purpose of all the urban tree planting initiatives happening these days, or the big push for tree planting on school campuses? Shown here are two of the programs I have been fortunate to collaborate with. One is called Greening the Gateway Cities, run by a state agency, the Department of Conservation and Recreation in Massachusetts. And the other is the Sacramento Tree Foundation's Sacramento Shade Program. So tree planting is the goal, right? Wrong. I would argue that tree planting is not the goal in and of itself. And this is really critical to remember when we want long-term outcomes. Rather, tree planting is a means towards the broader goal of making urban trees and schoolyards urban areas and schoolyards more livable, sustainable, equitable, and resilient. There are a great many benefits of urban trees. I'm sure most of you are already aware of them, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. These benefits are sometimes framed as ecosystem services, or trees are viewed as essential green infrastructure, or sometimes green stormwater infrastructure. Or one of the newer buzz phrases is that trees are nature-based solutions. And some of the specific benefits include cooling for thermal comfort, shade for reducing building energy use through air conditioning reduction, reducing stormwater runoff, nature play spaces, among many, many others. But the trees have to survive and be healthy to provide these benefits. And also, what about tree problems? People can have nuanced opinions about trees, appreciating their benefits while also being frustrated with tree-related problems and challenges. These include droppings of fruit, nuts, and leaves that get messy on sidewalks and cars, and roots interfering with built infrastructure. So these problems are referred to as ecosystem disservices. They are basically the flip side of ecosystem services. The services are defined as the benefits that people derive from functioning ecosystems, and ecosystem disservices are defined as the ecosystem generated functions, processes, and attributes that result in perceived or actual negative impacts on human well being. So you might be wondering, why is someone promoting tree planting talking about disservices? Well, it's because they relate to a variety of challenges that can sometimes prevent people from wanting to participate in tree planting. So the ecosystem disservices related to trees and urban spaces, these include infrastructure conflicts, such as trees that damage sidewalks, buildings, and pipes. If you live in an area that experiences power outages from hurricanes, blizzards, or other storms, then you've experienced this kind of disservice from trees falling over in power lines. Managing that particular disservice is a major focus of arborists working for municipalities and utility companies. Health concerns include allergens, with some species more prone to aggravating allergies than others. There can also be injuries and even deaths when major branches or whole trees fall over, and municipalities sometimes get sued about this. While such events are really rare, they're of course tragic, and they can be prevented through proactive tree care and arborists following industry safety standards. There's even a specialized area of urban forestry called tree risk management, which seeks to do routine inspections, pruning, and when deemed necessary, removals. There can also be aesthetic and social disservices. Some residents might view tree planting as a sign of gentrification and worry about whether a neighborhood is being greened for new residents, not longtime residents. Other residents might have grievances with messy trees, which can be highly subjective. I have a screenshot here from an editorial in the Los Angeles Times from someone who hates jacarandas, partly because of their purple petals being annoying to clean up. But other people might love that tree because of its flowers. In this way, whether some particular characteristic of a tree is a service or a disservice depends a lot on someone's perspectives, values, and lived experiences. So again, why am I bringing up the downsides of trees? Because it relates directly to maintenance and also to people's willingness to plant new trees, as we will get into in the rest of this presentation. The central takeaway message that I want to get across is that tree maintenance is central to tree health and survival, so that ecosystem services can be maximized and disservices can be minimized. And this is true whether you're talking about a street tree, a park tree, or a school ground tree. So next, I will give some examples of urban tree mortality studies from research projects that I led or supported. These studies are all tracking survival or mortality of trees during the establishment period, which is the first few years after planting when trees are extra vulnerable. The first example comes from Holyoke, Massachusetts, which is a mid-sized post-industrial town that's had a lot of population loss since its major manufacturing companies left town. It was once the paper-making capital of the US, and subsequent municipal budgetary challenges. As with many post-industrial towns, Holyoke's demographics have changed over the past several decades, and today Holyoke actually has the highest proportion of residents that are Puerto Rican of any city in the US. So the tree planting program is called Greening the Gateway Cities. It's run by a state agency in Massachusetts. Gateway cities refers to towns that can help reinvigorate the regional economy in New England. The program is run by state foresters who step in and do a lot of the coordinating and planting work on behalf of municipal departments, who are often severely understaffed, although usually happy to have the help. Seasonal local work crews are hired to do the planting. Holyoke was one of the first towns in the program. Over 700 trees were planted and then checked when they were 1 to 3 years old after planting. Trees were planted in a variety of site types, including sidewalks, parking lots, public parks, and institutional spaces like schools and public housing. The city arborist there ended up not wanting to be involved at all, and a local nonprofit organization that was supposed to help with maintenance had their own staffing challenges and couldn't help either. So the state foresters realized that the trees were going to suffer if nobody handled irrigation, and ended up having the seasonal work crews handle all of the watering for the trees that they could more easily access, so the street and the park trees. So those are the trees with a little DCR written under them. That's the state agency. But the local property owners, who are the program kind of recipients, they were responsible for tree care at the other sites. So then what happened is a bad drought summer occurred right in the middle of this several-year planting campaign. And although Massachusetts is in a climate that gets year-round precipitation, about 50 inches a year, the drought summer had only about 60% of normal rain. So for Massachusetts, that's a really unusual summer. We ended up having this kind of natural experiment with trees stewarded by two different groups, either the state foresters and their crews, or the program recipients, who were basically the property owners or managers. And some trees experienced that bad drought during their first two growing seasons, while others were planted just after the drought and didn't experience that same stress. The bar graph shows those different groupings along the bottom axis, and then the y-axis is the survival outcomes. So, for instance, the trees that experienced the bad drought summer and were stewarded by local property owners and managers, these trees had, by far, the worst mortality. Only 47% survived, 53% died, and perhaps worst of all, most of those dead trees were left standing in the ground, looking unsightly, reflecting poorly on the program. For the statistical analysis, we compared the drought versus no drought differences across the two types of stewards. For the trees maintained by the state foresters and their crews, the drought had no statistical impact on survival. For the trees maintained by the property owners and managers, there was indeed a big impact on survival. And the trees stewarded by the foresters were statistically 5 times more likely to survive. So I like to think of this study as boiling down to the conclusion of, oh, sorry about that noise, of kind of no duh, if you water a tree during a drought, then they're more likely to survive. So that conclusion may seem obvious to anyone who's even been a gardener of plants at home. The nuance comes from the complex stewardship relationships among the many groups involved. So while my university colleagues at UMass Amherst and I were chugging numbers and writing up this analysis, the state foresters had already made up their minds based on their anecdotal observations. For the rest of the towns in the Greening the Gateway Cities program, they planned ahead for tree care during the first couple of summers to be done by the paid local crews. And sure enough, the monitoring that my university colleagues actually at Clark University have done in the other towns shows that survival has improved. Part of why I'm highlighting this study is that it's possible to learn from what worked and, just as importantly, what didn't work. The next example is from East Palo Alto, which is in the San Francisco Bay Area. Palo Alto is a very wealthy town. Many major tech companies are based there, but East Palo Alto is not so wealthy, more working class, lower middle class. Right next to Palo Alto is a separate municipality. So about 600 trees were planted alongside the sound wall of Highway US 101 by the nonprofit called Canopy. The project was designed by a board-certified master arborist. That's the highest level of certification from the International Society of Arboriculture. His name is Dave Muffley, the gentleman with the beard right there. He actually later was the head arborist for the new Apple Company campus. So this planting project was done with an enormous amount of labor from volunteers, including dedicated board members of the nonprofit, as well as big volunteer workdays, sometimes from nearby corporations, and tons of time from Canopy's Teen Urban Foresters program. These trees were closely supervised during contractor planting and received drip irrigation and extensive early care, including adjusting stakes, trimming back weeds from the highway sound wall, and pruning. The survivorship at 6 years was 96.3%, which translates to 0.6% annual mortality. So that's less than 1% loss each year. This is actually the highest establishment survival or lowest establishment mortality in the published literature. And it's due to a combination of arboricultural expertise, organizational capacity to train and manage volunteers, and a paid youth internship program. The last example is another case of unusual high survival during establishment. When I say unusual, I want to note that based on a literature review that I'm not going over in depth today, but some colleagues at the University of Florida and others and I did, Typically, the annual mortality rate during establishment for planted trees in urban settings is around 6 or 7%. That's 6 or 7% each year. That last East Palo Alto example, establishment annual mortality was under 1%. And for this Philly example, it's 1.6%. So these are case studies in establishment success. And so it's important to hone in on what made these programs tick, try to emulate their practices. This particular planting happened in the Kingsessing Recreation Center, which is in West Philly. And Philly, similar to Holyoke, is a post-industrial city that experienced major population loss and major budgetary drops and personnel drops for their city parks department. So there's been a major role of nonprofits over the last several decades. A nonprofit called University City Green that operates in West Philly, they led the planting. And like in East Palo Alto, there was a paid youth internship program and extensive volunteer labor. 150 trees were planted, mostly on the streets surrounding the park, but also a few interior park trees. And this is in a neighborhood where a lot of people don't have cars, so there's a ton of pedestrians benefiting from these new trees. The trees received irrigation through gator bags, meaning that during the summer, crews and volunteers drove around with watering trucks, or sometimes had to hand carry water buckets over to those trees. And the photos here show one stretch of the park just before and immediately after the trees got planted. So they were planted in spring of 2006. And here's a Google Street View shot of those same trees 18 years later, grown and healthy, doing their job, shading that pedestrian corridor. So I again want to stress that both nonprofits had paid youth internship programs where they recruited students from local high schools to get arboricultural job training over the summer. These internships were funded by philanthropies that don't necessarily target urban forestry, but they do sponsor green jobs and job training. So this could be a great model for school tree plantings, and perhaps some of you in this room know of similar examples of youth and high school students as interns or otherwise helping with maintenance in schoolyards. Some other common program features for East Palo Alto and West Philly are that they had really tiny nonprofit organizations, but punching far above their weight with the help of dedicated volunteers, including board members, as well as paid youth interns and some really dedicated neighbors. The planting projects were also concentrated in a relatively small geographic area, which helped with the logistics of tree maintenance, made it somewhat easier, not easy by any stretch, but relatively easier compared to some other planting programs that have trees scattered all around an entire city. In both planting programs, planting day itself was closely supervised by arborists and other tree experts to make sure that the highest standards of planting techniques were followed. And then the maintenance involved watering, mulching, weeding, adjusting stakes, and initial pruning. I also want to point out that neither of these neighborhoods where these plantings took place are wealthy. They're both more working class areas, but the coordination, fundraising, dedication, and expertise of the nonprofits resulted in tremendous success. So now I want to move on to a discussion about planning ahead for maintenance. This pie chart comes from a study led by my colleague Theo Eisenman at UMass Amherst. He and his students were also in charge of the Holyoke study I mentioned earlier. So Theo surveyed over 40 urban tree planting initiatives in the US. For these program budgets, most funds go towards buying trees and planting trees, with only 12% towards maintenance. So here is our suggestion from a new essay we just released on recommendations and best practices for urban tree planting initiatives. We called it Beyond the Golden Shovel. When it comes to funding and budgets, consider roughly equal allocation across the 3 phases of a planting initiative. We consider those phases to be pre-planting, which involves planning and extensive engagement, installation, and then post-planting, where maintenance and monitoring are central. And I want to stress that funding for all these phases might not come from the same grant or source. There can be a mix of grants, donations, general fund, bond measures, depending on the locality and the possibilities wherever your programs are taking place. And so if you're thinking ahead about maintenance for a planting project, here are some initial questions to consider. First and foremost, who will do the maintenance? Will this be paid or volunteer labor or a mix? Do volunteers have access to campus when school is not in session? What kinds of additional training might be needed? And in addition to the labor of maintenance, there's also the labor of coordination. Who will be in charge of that? Is there a green champion at this school, such as a teacher or parent who can assist? Then there's also the timing of maintenance, which can help to plan for when different people need to pitch in. Depending on what region you're in and local climate, there might be considerations for maintenance in different times of the year, different seasons, and then which tasks need to happen weekly, like watering, or monthly or yearly. I also want to acknowledge that most of the maintenance I've been talking about is for very young trees during establishment. But as trees age and grow, it becomes necessary to have arborists or other tree professionals involved due to the specialized equipment and expertise for things like large tree pruning and tree risk assessment. Some other questions regarding maintenance to consider during planning include species traits and which species might seem easier to maintain, perhaps less messy. There's also considerations for supplies and equipment like irrigation systems, mulch, and pruners. Some local nonprofits that I know of have set up things like tool lending libraries to help with this. And last but not least, there's siting considerations. Might there be locations for planting where maintenance, especially watering and irrigation, would be a little easier? These many considerations about maintenance actually come up when people resist tree planting or just don't want to get involved. I collaborated with some great colleagues at Temple University to understand why residents and community leaders in the Philly region are sometimes reluctant to plant trees. One of the most common concerns was about maintenance, often related to financial worries about the cost of tree care and residents thinking ahead about ecosystem disservices and burdens that could come years down the line. So, although these quotes are coming from residents, I think they might resonate a lot with what schools and school officials might object to. So let me read some of these quotes. Free trees are not the true cost. It's 35 plus years of expense in tree care. Trees are messy. They drop pollen and flowers. The roots busted up the pipes. New neighbors aren't taking care of their trees. Community leaders expressed similar sentiments. If I'm a homeowner and someone tells me I need a tree in front of my house, at first it's a beautiful idea. Then you have to think about it. What kind of tree is this going to be? What about when it falls over? Who is going to take care of it? What happens when the roots grow? Another community leader said, a few hundred or $1,000 to have a tree removed is unbearably high for our community. Kind of understand people are nervous about it. That can be several months of rent to get a big tree removed. So what we found with this research on barriers to participation in tree planting initiatives, in general, it wasn't that people didn't like trees or value them in a broad sense. Rather, people had concerns about being supported with tree care and maintenance. To address these kinds of challenges, it's important to start with listening and validating people's legitimate concerns. Plans can sometimes be adjusted to address local concerns or priorities. And as articulated by colleagues of mine who did an urban forest strategic plan in Philadelphia, it's important to move at the speed of trust. And then community and stakeholder engagement can happen before planting day, on planting day, and continue long after planting with teachers, principals, facility staff, parents, and neighbors. There can be festive celebrations for planting day and fun tree care work days. And even if trees die or get removed, that can be an opportunity to honor the fallen trees, like this cute example of a neighbor of mine that put flowers in a tree stump. I want to point out that there are ongoing management cycles for trees, from engagement and planning through species selection, installation, maintenance, eventual removal and replacement, and then beginning the cycle anew. So I'm getting to my last few slides here. In conclusion, I hope I have conveyed the crucial role of maintenance for young tree survival, and also the fact that people's legitimate concerns about tree care labor and ecosystem disservices can present a barrier to their willingness to plant new trees. But just as negative stories about trees can circulate around neighborhoods or around school districts, so too can positive stories. And as those success stories build up, it can rebuild trust and willingness to plant. I also talked about the importance of considering funding sources and budgets and thinking about funding for more than just purchasing the trees. And then I also briefly touched upon the notion that planting and maintenance are part of larger tree management cycles. So I wanted to just remind folks of the big take-home message here. Maintenance is central to tree health and survival to maximize ecosystem services and minimize ecosystem disservices. So before I close out, I wanted to toss in one slide here about an exciting new project that some colleagues and I have launched about trees in California schools. We will be working in elementary schools in 3 school districts and characterizing tree resources in terms of species mixes and vulnerability to climate change, as well as microclimate benefits. There's also a social science component to investigate tree management and get the perspectives of key stakeholders, including teachers, facility staff, principals, and parents. The research team involves me and Natalie Van Dorn. She's another Forest Service researcher, as well as faculty, postdocs, and students at UCLA, UC Berkeley, and UC Davis. And then our core partners are CAL FIRE, which is the state agency in California that manages urban forestry programs, and of course, Green Schoolyards America. It's been such a pleasure working with them, learning more about school tree programs throughout the state. Our team has some initial products coming out soon, so stay tuned for that. There will be a policy report from UCLA researchers about the drivers of extensive impervious surfaces at California schools, the historical and current policies that maintain all that asphalt and pavement, and then also an associated story map about land cover patterns in schools. So that's it for my presentation. I have a lot of colleagues to thank, and the people listed on this slide and many more were part of the research studies that I shared with you today, and also the partners for the new schools tree study. And a lot of the lessons learned I shared are just really me channeling the wisdom of the amazing colleagues that I work with in urban forestry practice. So I always extend appreciation to them for letting me study their programs. With that, I will end on a slide of some of the fun monitoring work that's happened over the years for different urban tree programs. And there's my email in case afterwards anyone wants to get in touch. Thank you so much, and I will be turning it over momentarily.
Thank you so much, Lara. And I'm going to pass it off to Rachel, who will continue the conversation.
Thanks so much, Lara and Lauren. Really great to hear about these studies. I am glad to be with you today. I'm going to share just a little bit about some of the resources that we have on our website. And as Lauren already mentioned before, we do have a new resource that is up. It is part 2 of our How to Care for Schoolyard Forests article series, and it focused more on stewardship tasks and costs and additional resources. We included some of the content in our 8th lecture series earlier this year, but it is now published in a kind of comprehensive form now. And so with this focus on maintenance and stewardship that Lara just really brought home for us, I wanted to take just a few minutes to share some of the details with you as they relate to schoolyard forests. So next, please, Lauren. So in our part 2 of our How to Care for Schoolyard Forests, stewardship tasks, costs, and resources, we have a lot of expertise and information on watering, excuse me. Next, please. I'm going to go through these next ones pretty quick. On mulching, which is important task. Next. On weeding, next. And on pruning. And lastly, next. On tree health monitoring over time. And so we also include ways for each of those tasks to engage students. This is a really important part of stewardship and being able to, as Lara mentioned, really receive the benefits of trees and other vegetation and greening on school grounds. It really does, it relies on the entire school community and the district to kind of change their mindset to change the paradigm for this type of infrastructure, if you will. And so our part 2 has resources for each of these things. And particularly like we have here, this tree health monitoring worksheet is an example of what we have in our educator resources. So in our Schoolyard Forest System resource library, which I'm sure the link has been shared in the chat and will be again, you can find educator resources. And so these are, again, ways that you can engage students in these maintenance tasks that are really important. Next. And so as a follow-up to Lara's important emphasis on maintenance and planning, we wanted to share this simplified timeline for tree care over the course of a tree's life. So starting with either a seedling or a young tree, what does this really look like? I think it starts with the right tree, right place, right? If you talk to a lot of urban forestry folks who know a lot about trees and tree planting, it really starts with right tree and right place. And that will solve problems down the line, those disservices that Laura mentioned. If you're planting a tree that's going to grow to a much larger canopy than you need in a particular area or want in a particular area, that's going to be a problem. So you need to make sure you have the right species. You need to have it in the right place. And so again, whether you're starting from seedling or a young tree, some of the main tasks that are going to be, associated with this phase of the timeline is, obviously water and mulching, and that may require irrigation. There are also tree gator bags, these big bags that you can put on the base of a tree that will, hold up to 5 gallons of water or more, that you can do that doesn't require irrigation. That's another option. But mulching, of course, is important. It is a seedling, certainly a cage for protection from either, if you are in a more rural area, deer, but also most likely children running through a schoolyard. So, and then of course, monitoring for health is something that you're going to start right from the beginning. So, but with a younger tree from 2 to 5 years, all those same things are true, water and mulching, but mulching and water really need to match the tree canopy. And so it's usually they say a tree's roots are spreading out as far as the tree canopy does. So if you're leaving your irrigation, drip irrigation around the base of a tree and it hasn't been brought out to where the canopy is, then you're not watering that tree properly, and it's not good for its health. So as an example of something you will want to be doing over that time course of 2 to 5 years, you'll want to be moving that irrigation out. You also might want stakes. Usually young trees that have a bendable and have a not as strong but bendable trunk will need staking, as you see in this picture. And then there's pruning too, which is really important at this stage, to prune for shape and structure so that you don't have issues down the line. And an arborist can really go into the details of why, some of the problems that can arise, and you can look them up on the internet pretty easily. But pruning at this stage is really important. And so, and then as you move into established trees, and this can be, it varies what what each species, when they're established, but larger trees that have been in the ground for a number of years and have really been able to sink their roots in, again, we'll need that same kind of, if you're still watering, hopefully in many places you will not need to keep watering. But if you do, you want to make sure you're matching, again, that canopy, and you want to be monitoring for health. And there may be some pruning that is necessary at this stage, for any number of reasons, whether that's for safety or if there is a disease, if the tree is not doing well. Hopefully it is, but if it isn't, there may be some pruning that needs to be done. And then there is kind of a final stage, and depending on where you are or who you are, and if you're a parent like myself at a school, you will be moving on from that school, and you may not ever get to this stage, or you may, because there are trees that have been planted many, many years ago. But either way, a part of a tree's life cycle is death and sometimes removal. So it is something that is important to plan for, depending on where your canopy is. And obviously, hopefully you don't have to think about this for a very long time if you're just starting in a schoolyard forest, but that will require a professional arborist, somebody who knows how to handle a large tree removal, and that is a costly expense. And there are ways that you can then repurpose that lumber, as well as, do some activities around memorializing or replanting. But so there are costs associated with each stage, but proper planting, as I mentioned, right tree, right place, and then pruning and care throughout the stages can really help you reduce any costs throughout and at the end of a tree's life cycle. So in other words, you're less likely to need to remove a large tree for many years if you can do the maintenance like Lara was describing. Next, please. So we shared this at an earlier session on stewardship, but I wanted to revisit it really quickly. This is in our part 2 stewardship document. To take a step back, as compared to other more intensive greening on school grounds, like a garden, gardens are amazing and wonderful. Trees require relatively less time, effort, and maintenance beyond the routine tasks that I just went through. There is a commitment. I want to state though that trees are a great way to provide greening and shade to schools and school districts. So, and relatively, much of this care and maintenance can be spread out rather than a daily kind of need. So this diagram illustrates how, schoolyard forest stewardship needs generally decrease over time, but a forest's ability to provide shade increases, as do the benefits associated with this. So like reduced cooling costs for adjacent buildings and health and learning benefits for children, not to mention all of the aesthetic benefits of a beautiful mature canopy. Next. I wanted to share just a quick vignette or a quick story of a great program in Washington, D.C. that the D.C. Department of Transportation, as well as the Office of the State Superintendent of Education in those 2 offices within the District of Columbia, have created a really neat urban wood reuse program where when the Department of Transportation is removing a street tree, they are allowing, actually schools can go onto their website and ask for any number of wood products that the Department of Transportation will help create. So it's seating or tables and benches, etc. So it's a really neat way if you do have to take large mature trees down, which is always sad, but it can be necessary and it can be beautifully reused, particularly for outdoor education. And so this is a really nice example, and there's a website here that you can check out. So next slide. So in closing, we wanted to circle back to the principles that kind of underlie the main messages that are shared today. School district's ability to kind of receive the benefits or services and reduce the disservices of trees, as Lara described, really, rests on the ability of school districts to kind of shift their mindsets and cultivate support systems for how they plan for school ground design first, use second, and management third. And it's third, but no less important. And so these principles are, we as an organization are really trying to emphasize and trying to, support districts in doing this shift because it does take support and help. And the first principle is embrace nature, right? So we do have to go from a paradigm of asphalt to ecosystems. And in order to do that, really do need to help schools and districts and a lot of us embrace nature because it often can be kind of messy or what we perceive as messy, but all of that also brings all of those great learning opportunities to a school ground, right? So it brings habitat and other things and things that kids can really engage in. So that's important. Next slide. So the principle next is expect change. So, the natural system, like Lara and I both described, changes. Trees change, they do grow, they become big, they may have to be removed, et cetera. That system changes, seasonal changes, and the human system changes too. So particularly in schools, right? You have a group of parents, they move through, or families or caregivers, they move through, and then they're gone, and as does the administration. So expecting that and planning for that and planning for ways that can kind of support consistency when there is change is really important. Next slide. So, and the last principle is just developing this ethic of care and connection. So it's really just about stewardship, the idea of stewardship and what does that really mean? And so the more the support districts can cultivate and receive in order to kind of understand the tree care timeline, to plan for it, to engage and train district staff, to get professionals when needed, to engage students in stewardship and develop kind of school routines and culture around stewardship that embeds it in the day-to-day, the more likely that we will have thriving schoolyard forests. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and Lara. There is a lot happening in the chat, which points to, I think, how invested and interested people are in this topic. And we'll get started with some Q&A. And whatever questions we don't get to today, we will try to address them and share along with the recording and along with a complete list of all the resources that were shared today. I know a lot of people are asking for links. So a question from early on, this is directed to Lara about the East Palo Alto project and talking about tree size. So the comparison between, the benefit of planting trees from seedling versus planting larger trees. Meredith is asking how big the trees were when they were planted, but also that comparison in terms of tree survival.
Sure. So great question. The trees in East Palo Alto were number 5 containerized stock, which is about 5-gallon. And they were handpicked from nurseries by the arborist I referred to earlier to try and get the best quality. But then he also relayed to me that there were some root bound issues. So a lot of that containerized stock can tend to have roots that start encircling. I've even been at conferences where I've seen presentations where, like, as trees are moved from seedling size to different containers, they get repeatedly root bound. So there can be some justification sometimes for wanting to plant even smaller seedlings. But when there's good relationships with nurseries and good knowledge of which nurseries produce good stock, then it can be quite reasonable to plant, for example, a lot of the containerized stock that we find here in the Western US. And so one of the solutions to dealing with that these contractors did for the planting along the highway in East Palo Alto, that I also later personally did for like a yard tree in front of my house, is if you see the root bound issue, then just beat up the roots, for lack of a sophisticated way of saying it. Like, really pound at the roots with your feet and your hands. And if there's encircling, girdling roots, that will damage that tree as it grows. And so cut them. And there's well-established techniques on how to do this that I am not trained in. There's people who can give whole lessons on root pruning, but as someone who wasn't trained in it, I did it for a tree at my own house. I saw how badly root bound this tree that I bought at a local nursery was, and I decided I'm just going to whack at it, and that helped the tree. That helped the tree a lot. There are a variety of other kinds of stock and sizes of trees that can be bought. The program that I referred to in West Philly was using balled and burlap stock, which is much more common in the northeast of the US. Partners that I have also worked with in Philly now use bare root stock that's grown by a particular nursery in New York State. So there are particular issues that vary based on your stock type, and that arborists and other kind of tree planting professionals in your area will know about, and hopefully, get advice from them to make sure that you're thinking about stock issues in the right way. And just having someone on site on planting day can also help with some really basic errors that sometimes happen, like planting too deep or not deep enough, and various kinds of things that will cause the tree problems as it ages, but that can be fixed really quickly on planting day. If there's just someone walking around, the volunteers don't themselves all have to be experts or contractors, just someone needs to be around and say, before you backfill in that soil, let someone who knows what they're doing take a look and make sure the tree's doing all right.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Laura. Sort of along the same lines of just maintaining trees. Some people are asking about caging to protect from wildlife. And in case this is related, people are also asking about dealing with like muddy areas around trees. Um, and I know, there's some comments in the chat about adding mulch, but if you want to address both or one of those, that would be great.
So I now live in San Diego, but I grew up in Philadelphia and just moved out here to California 2 years ago. And yeah, deer will eat your trees. If you're in an area with a lot of white-tailed deer and different kind of wildlife issues, different parts of the country. So let's see. I mean, a school in West Philly doesn't have a lot of deer, but if it's right next to certain parts of the city park system there, it would. Or certainly the suburbs of Philadelphia are full of deer. So yeah, it's very context specific on whether or not that would help. And It also, though, is size specific. So getting back to the size issue that was just mentioned, those little kind of whips and seedlings are going to get munched. They're much more vulnerable. But if you're planting something that's 1 or 2 inch caliper, so like the trunk is already 1 or 2 inches at the time of planting and the tree is already like 6 feet tall, then you're much more protected from some of these wildlife issues. So as with everything else in life, it's a trade-off of the particular challenges in your area. As far as like muddy areas under trees, yeah, I mean, I would go back to mulch as a good solution there, but I also wonder, why is it getting so muddy? Like, what's going on with the irrigation? Like, that's
Mm.
not something that's desirable to have really, really wet pools around trees. That could be not necessarily healthy for the trees if they're getting a lot of waterlogging. So I would wonder if that's more of an issue related to like drainage problems in that part of the schoolyard. I mean, without knowing the specifics of the examples someone raised. It just does not strike me as something that should be there all the time. Not very many tree species, only the ones that are like riparian in nature. Not very many tree species like having their feet wet all the time. I
Yeah,
don't know if that
that
was
makes
helpful, but that's
sense.
just my initial reflection.
Yeah, and I did see someone say, looking at a mulch, or, we've seen some designs in other schools where there's obviously, depending on the schoolyard, maybe there's some kind of decking to help protect the roots on one side of the tree. I don't know if you've seen that, Rachel.
Yeah, we have seen that in some schoolyards where they create a like a bench almost around the tree. And obviously you need to leave a lot of space for that tree to grow and not have it impact the roots in any way. But you can do that. We've seen that in some schools. You can do that successfully. You'd have to be able to kind of keep it high enough so that things can't hide underneath there, like rodents and things like that. But high enough and wide enough you could do that. I think something that I mentioned in the chat is like leaf drop. And I think a lot of times schools are really trying to get rid of leaf drop a lot and gather it up. But leaf drop can be a really nice mulch, and it's kind of light and more, kind of natural, if you will, to that tree. So that tree's own leaf drop can be a thing that hangs out at the base of the tree to some extent. And, that also really provides great habitat for bugs, which is often a big part of elementary curriculum, and provides habitat so you can find those bugs. So again, it's another opportunity if you're not constantly, deadheading, pulling out leaf drop, but allowing for that kind of nature and mess, if you will, to be there. You have a lot more opportunities for engaging students.
Yes, that is a great point, and I think a few people talked about, resources for mulch and leaves. But yeah, schools do not need to be 100% perfectly like weedless or leafless. And I just added to the chat, having like a particular area that's the forested area can give the maintenance staff permission to just leave the leaves in that area. Leaf litter, it's not litter, but leaf material on the ground to add moisture to the soil, etc. Um, wow, there's so many questions. Someone was asking, maybe this is uh, for another day, but if you have an answer, um, someone was talking about how they can't remove asphalt due to there being toxins underneath or asbestos concerns. And they're curious about potted trees. Any tips?
I can take that one. That can be a big issue, and it can be a really tough one to deal with. Of course, we have seen schools do some big mitigation projects where they are taking out the asphalt and digging down deep enough to remove that toxic soil and putting new things in. But I recognize that not, every school or district has the ability to do that. But that has been done. Planting certain species in pots, there, depending on where you are, that could be limited. But as an example, in California, I have seen a lot of lemon trees and olive trees in pots. And, obviously those aren't necessarily big canopy producing type things, but you could certainly try. There's also, bamboo in pots. If you're really just looking for shade and greenery, actually bamboo can be great in pots, and it can be, actually help control, contain certain spreading types of bamboo. You can keep it in a pot and you can create a nice green shield and create some shade. But there's lots of other ideas for that. But it is obviously limited because you're limited by the soil that you have in that pot. And, bigger trees need bigger amounts. So, but yeah, there are some possibilities.
I will just echo on to that, saying, I feel like this discussion around what could be possible for potted trees just mirrors some ongoing conversations about just limited planting space, even if there are situations where you can break concrete or asphalt and plant a tree because of this, that, or the other site infrastructure or resident property owner or school administrator concerns, right? Sometimes it's not big tree or little tree, it's little tree or nothing. And if it's little tree or nothing, go for the little tree, right? Better than nothing. Or go for the big shrub that, if pruned in a certain way, looks more like a tree. There's not really a botanical or biological difference between a big tree and or a little tree and a small shrub. They're all continuations of woody plants. So if that's the option open to you, go for it. Yeah, you're not going to fit a large tree in those separate pots, but whatever the small species are in your region, that's a great option. I did also just want to echo, Lauren, you said not to call leaf litter. I mean, us ecologists call it leaf litter, but I know that it gets confusing when you're talking to a broader audience. So I just want to throw that out there, because if you're using educational materials about, like, rooted in environmental science and ecology, we're going to call it litter because that's what ecologists call it. But yes, it's not the same as like trash litter.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I know that we're at time. I do want to thank you both again so much, and we'll share some of the other unanswered questions with the recording sometime next week. We also encourage you to come to our community of practice for schoolyard forests, as well as a continuation of this series in 2025. Yeah, thank you both. Please check out all the resources, and we'll see everyone next year. Happy holidays. Be safe, be well, and take care of some trees.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Lara.